What up, Doe? Thank you for stopping by for part 6, the final installment of Rosa Parks tied. Her feet hurt. The following Thursday, December 8th, Dr. King and attorney Fred Gray and others met with 3 Montgomery City commissioners and representatives of the bus company. They presented the 3 demands. The bus company people denied that the drivers were discourteous to black riders and would not hear of hiring any black drivers on the predominantly black routes. They also said the first come, first served seating arrangement was in violation of the city's segregation laws. A lot of people lost their jobs because they supported the boycott. Both Parks and I lost our jobs, but neither of us was fired. He resigned. Mr. Armstrong, the white owner of the private barbering concession at Maxwell Field Air Force Base, issued an order that there was to be no discussion of the bus protest or Rosa Parks in his establishment. Parks said he would not work anywhere where his wife's name could not be mentioned. I was discharged from Montgomery Fair Department Store in January of 1956, but I was not told by the personnel officer that it was because of the boycott. They closed the shop. They gave me 2 weeks' pay and my bonus money, and I went home. This was a blessing in a way, I guess, because then I didn't have to worry about how I was going to get to and from work without riding the buses. I worked at home, taking in sewing. I started traveling quite a bit, making appearances because of my arrest and the boycott. I was on the executive board of directors of the MIA, and I did whatever was needed. Many people needed those things because they were out of work and unable to buy clothing. Those who had jobs were out many pairs of shoes walking to and from work. After a while, quite a sophisticated system was developed. There were 20 private cars and 14 station wagons. There were 32 pickup and transfer sites and scheduled service from 5:30 in the morning until 12:30 at night. About 30,000 people were transported to and from work every day. What about the other people who usually rode the buses? Well, I don't have the numbers, but a lot of them were transported by their employers. Some of the white women couldn't get along without their maids. A lot of white women drove their housekeepers and cooks to and from work every day. Late in January, the 3 city commissioners met with 3 black ministers who were not a part of the MIA. These ministers agreed to a plan for the bus seating that would reserve 10 seats in front for whites and 10 seats in back for blacks, with the rest available first come, first served. Then the commission told Montgomery Advertiser, and that Sunday the paper ran big headlines announcing the end of the boycott. But Dr. King and the Reverend Abernathy and the other leaders of the MIA heard what was happening. They went all over the black community Saturday night saying it was a lie. Mayor Gale called the leaders of the boycott a bunch of Negro radicals. In early February, Fred Gray filed suit in U.S. District Court saying that bus segregation was unconstitutional. By that time, the appeal of my case had been thrown out on a technicality, meaning my conviction was upheld. The trials began in March, and Dr. King was the first to be tried. It was March 19th, and I went down to the courthouse. People crowded around and tried to get inside, but they weren't letting in anyone unless they had a seat. They wouldn't let anyone sit on the floor or stand in the aisle. I was invited to tell about what had happened to me at various churches, schools, and organizations. I did whatever I could. I went to New York for the first time at the invitation of Miles Horton. He asked me to appear with him at some meetings in the city. I stayed with a couple named Charlotte and Stuart Meacham, who were Quakers. It seems that segregation only took place on the bus. Let's shake it. I was not accustomed to so much attention. There was a time when it bothered me that I was always identified with that one incident. The white people tried to break the boycott, but not giving the church cars any insurance. The white people tried to break the boycott by not giving the church cars any insurance. Dr. King got in touch with a black insurance agent in Atlanta named T.M. Alexander, and T.M. Alexander got Lloyd's of London, the big insurance company in England, to write a policy for the church-operated cars. James Blake, the driver who had me arrested, was the driver of one of the buses I got on. In this picture, the caption reads, "Rosa poses in the front seat of a Montgomery bus on December 21st, 1956, the day the buses were integrated." Again, Rosa poses in the front seat of a Montgomery bus on December 21st, 1956, the day the buses were integrated. It will do you well to look up the definition of the word poses, or posing, to pose. Rosa poses in the front seat of a Montgomery bus on December 21st, 1956. I got on 2 different buses, I guess, and each time they took pictures until they were satisfied. The reporter sat behind me each time while the photographer took pictures. James Blake never has come forward with his own feelings about what happened. I remember reading in the 1970s that some reporter tried to interview him, but his wife said he was sick and didn't want to talk about that mess. I suspect that he never did change his attitude about African Americans and how we should be treated. I'm not sure she told us how. He never changed his attitude, so she's assuming he felt some kind of way about the way African Americans should have been treated. Now, you and I know that African American is a misnomer, so he felt some kind of way about how theoretical humans should be treated. Let's shake it. I was still traveling around, making appearances. About a month after we moved to Detroit, I went to Boston, Massachusetts. I met the president of Hampton Institute, a black college in Hampton, Virginia. He asked me if I would accept a job as a hostess at Holly Tree Inn, which was the residence and guest house on the campus. I would be in charge of the off-the-campus guests and also the men and women, faculty and staff who lived there. 4 women worked half days cleaning the rooms, and I would be in charge of them. I accepted the position at Hampton, hoping that there would be a place for my husband and mother as well, but it didn't work out. They remained in Detroit. Neither was well, although Parks did pretty good and went to school to get his barber's license. I should go back to Detroit. Back in Detroit, I worked in the home of a seamstress friend. And then later, I got a job at a small clothing factory on the west side of the city. I was still traveling around quite a bit, speaking about the bus boycott and the civil rights movement, which had really gotten active by this time. Dr. King and other ministers had formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to fight against segregation in other areas of Southern life. The civil rights movement was having a big effect. The president at the time was Lyndon Baines Johnson, born and raised in Texas. It was he who pushed through the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It aimed to guarantee blacks the right to vote and to use public accommodations, and provided for the federal government to prosecute those who did not obey this law. If I'm not mistaken, in the show that I did called Martin Luther the King and the Civil Rights Movement, or Martin Luther the King and Civil Rights, we saw that in the Civil Rights Act, there was no mention of blacks. And she said Lyndon Baines Johnson pushed through the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It aimed to guarantee blacks the right to vote and to use public accommodations, and provided for the federal government to prosecute those who did not obey this law. Again, in the Civil Rights Act, there was no mention of blacks. Correct me if I'm wrong. Please put the correction in the comments. However, I don't think you'll find blacks in the Civil Rights Act. Tell me in the comments what you find. And then, who are they speaking of? In the beginning of 1965, Dr. King and the SCLC decided to stage a campaign of demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, where they weren't having much progress in getting black people registered to vote. They decided to pack the jails by deliberately getting themselves arrested. In the beginning of 1965, Dr. King and the SCLC decided to stage a campaign of demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, where they weren't having much progress in getting black people registered to vote, in getting theoretical people registered to vote. Who are these people? And if they vote, do they become black people? Before they vote, who are these people? They weren't having much progress in getting these people registered to vote. Why is that? Well, not everyone I know votes, But there are huge demonstrations in order to get them and me to vote. They're not working. The TV news carried the scene, and that got civil rights activists angry. It also broadened the support of the civil rights movement among whites across the nation. Dr. King decided to call for a mass march from Selma to Montgomery, about 50 miles away. It was set for March 7, 1965. The SCLC applied for a march permit and got approval to have a maximum of 300 marchers on the two-lane segments of the Highway 80 between the two cities. The SCLC applied for a march permit and got approval to have a maximum of 300 marchers on the two-lane segments of Highway 80 between the two cities. On the four-lane sections closer to Selma and to Montgomery, there could be an unlimited number of marchers. I was invited to join the march for the last lap into downtown Montgomery. For appearances, no doubt. In this picture, we see the Selma to Montgomery march from left to right. Rosa, the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, Miss Juanita Abernathy, Ambassador Ralph Bunch, Dr. Martin Luther the King, Mrs. Jean Young, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and the Reverend L.V. Reese. Being on that march was a strange experience. It seemed like such a short time that I had been out of Alabama, but so many young people had grown up in that time. They didn't know who I was and couldn't care less about me because they didn't know me. Marchers on that final lap were supposed to be wearing special colored jackets or other clothing, and I wasn't wearing the right color. They just kept putting me out of the march, telling me I wasn't supposed to be in it. I got put out of that march 3 or 4 different times. Whenever they would put me out, I would just stand on the sidelines until somebody would pass by and say, "Miss Parks, come on and get in the march." I would say I was in it, but they put me out. The plot thickens. I couldn't keep up with them. And then some of those youngsters just sort of pushed me out of the way. When we got downtown, someone did have me go up to the front of the line, and I had my picture taken with Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, and Ralph Bunch, the first Black American winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and other important people. Mostly, I remember being put out of that march. Mostly, I remember being put out of that march. Mostly, Rosa Parks, the mother of the civil rights movement, remember being put out of that march. In this photo, we see President Lyndon B. Johnson with Congressman Walter Fauntroy, Dr. Martin Luther the King, and the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy after signing the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Chopping it up. Dr. King believed very strongly in the concept of nonviolence. My grandmother said when I was very young, but I just couldn't accept being pushed even at the cost of my life. I was raised to be proud and it had worked for me to stand up aggressively for myself. I know my husband said that when he was a teenager or a very young man in his hometown in eastern Alabama, he hadn't known anything about nonviolence either. He knew that he would have to talk up for himself if he wanted to protect himself. Most of the black people in Montgomery had similar feelings. To this day, I am not an absolute supporter of nonviolence in all situations. The same year I started working for John Conyers, Malcolm X was shot. I met him the week before he died. He had come to Detroit to speak, and I was sitting in the front row. I spoke to him, and he autographed the program for me. I had heard him speak before, but now his message was altogether different. I had a lot of admiration for him, considering his background and where he came from, and his having had to struggle so hard just to reach the point of being respected as a leader. He was a very brilliant man. Even when he was with the black Muslims, I didn't disagree with him altogether. Dr. King used to say that black people should receive brutality with love. And I believe that this was a goal to work for, but I couldn't reach that point in my mind at all. Malcolm wasn't a supporter of nonviolence either. I got ready to go to Memphis. Louise Taps, a friend in Detroit, and I were traveling together at that time, since Parks wasn't much for traveling. We got together with some other people and went to Memphis for the march that Dr. King was to have participated in. Harry Belafonte, the singer, took me to Atlanta for Dr. King's funeral in a private plane. Segregation has its benefits, I guess. The bus on which I was arrested back on December 1955 was part of the Cleveland Avenue line. Today, Cleveland Avenue is named Rosa Parks Boulevard. When Miss Rosa Parks boarded that bus in Montgomery, Alabama on that December afternoon in 1955, she sparked a revolution that would transform America. As Martin Luther King said, her refusal to cooperate with racism on that historic day was based on her personal sense of dignity and self-respect. By the accumulated indignities of days gone by and the boundless aspirations of generations yet unborn. For a long time, there has been a need for such books that illuminate the civil rights struggle. In these pages, Ms. Parks has movingly evoked the experiences and influences that shaped her formative years, the events that led to her appointment with history and her unrelenting faith. Here, in her own words, is the story of one of America's greatest freedom fighters. This is a quote from Coretta Scott King. Rosa Parks moved civil rights issues from the back of the bus to the front of America's conscience. She has led an extraordinary life full of great accomplishments, which are documented in this autobiography. She's a living gem. This was a quote from Congressman John Conyers. Rosa Parks' life story makes it clear that her 1955 refusal to surrender to segregation on a Montgomery city bus was no impulse born of tired feet. It was instead the natural response of a woman who can trace her family history to an African slave who saw Klansmen ride past her door as a child, who realized the damage done to blacks by racism at age 6, and whose life's work had been civil rights. Readers of any age will enjoy learning more about this remarkable American. This is from Julian Bond, civil rights leader. He says, a woman who can trace her family history to an African slave. Mr. Julian Bond, where did you get this information? Because in this part 6, final installment of Rosa Parks, Tad, her feet hurt. This is the first time I have heard any mention of an African or a slave. More than just an autobiography. Yes, it is. Rosa Parks' story of the Montgomery bus boycott is an insider's view of a pivotal moment in American history. Her humanity and courage are apparent everywhere in these pages. Yes, Rosa Parks is bout it and always has been bout it. And her feet was not hurting. She wasn't no old rickety woman wading in the waters. Her feet was hurt. She was tired. She finna sit down, which should be required reading for everyone, black or white. Charles Johnson, author of Middle Passages. Etymology Online. Rosa Parks, born in Tuskegee, Alabama. So was my great-grandmother and many of my other ancestors. Tuskegee. Etym Online. The online version of the etymology of words. Tuskegee, place in Alabama, named from a Muskogee tribal town, Tuskegee, first recorded in Spanish as Tuskegee, literally warriors. Do the right thing.